So with these traits that you can inherit, there are some that will have what we call a dominant or a recessive version of the gene that you can get from your mom or dad. So dominant, here we've got a picture of the Hulk, and recessive, we've got a picture of SpongeBob SquarePants. So let's just think for a minute, who's going to win in a fight between the Hulk and SpongeBob SquarePants? Well, that's a fairly one-sided fight. I think the Hulk is going to win. Even if we have, if we've got the two of them together, Hulk wins. If we have two Hulks fighting, well, one of the Hulks is going to win there. If we have two SpongeBobs fighting, one of the SpongeBobs is going to win here. We get two different copies of every gene. We call those alleles. We get two different copies of every gene, two alleles, one that comes from our mom and one that comes from our dad. And with some of these traits that we're going to look at, when we get different versions from mom than what we get from dad, we'll see that one wins. So some traits act like this. We are going to look at how to show that, how to figure out what you're going to look like when we have a dominant and a recessive trait. So dominant wins in a fight against recessive, recessive loses in a fight against dominant. But if we have just two recessives, two of the SpongeBobs, then we're going to show the SpongeBob trait. We're going to show the recessive trait. If we have two dominants, we're going to show the dominant trait, the Hulk trait here. So let's look at an example. If you put your finger in your ear and you come away with a little earwax, that earwax is going to be either a little bit wet or it's going to be dry and crumbly. And it turns out that wet earwax is the dominant version of that trait. Dry earwax is the recessive version. So to show dominant versus recessive, we're going to use a capital letter for dominant. We'll use E's here, E for earwax. So a capital E for wet earwax and a little e for dry earwax. So there are three possible genotypes. Genotypes being what your DNA looks like. We could have a big E, a dominant from mom, and a big E, dominant from dad. We could also have a big E from mom, dominant from mom, and a little e from dad. Or we could have a little e from mom and a little e from dad. Now, these are the three different combinations of those genes. We call them the three possible genotypes. These also get named. So the ones that are the same, we call those homozygous. So we have two of the same kind of letter. Homozygous, homo meaning same, and then zygous refers to your genes. Homozygous down here also, so two little letters. And then up on top, because it's two of the big letters, the dominant ones, we'll call that homozygous dominant. And the bottom one will be homozygous recessive. Two of the recessive version of that gene. And then in the middle, we'll call this one heterozygous. So the only difference in those words, we got the homo for same, or the hetero for different. Okay. Now, there are only two possible outcomes for what you look like, what your condition is. And we call those the two possible phenotypes. Either you have wet earwax or you have dry earwax. Now with wet earwax being dominant, if we go back up here, the dominant trait is the one that we show, the dominant version of that trait is the one that we show if we have one or two copies of the dominant gene, of the dominant allele. So in both of the top ones, we have at least one copy of that. So in this one here, we have a big letter and a little letter, but the big one wins. So we show the trait here. We show the dominant trait on that one. So for phenotypes, those two up on top are both going to be the dominant trait, the dominant phenotype, which is wet earwax. Oops. And then down here, this one is the recessive phenotype. We don't have any copies of the dominant one, no capital letters. And so this will be dry earwax. So, out of those three genotypes, only two possible phenotypes, and the dominant phenotype is going to be more common in this because there's two different ways to have the dominant phenotype. We can have two big E's or one big E and one little e. And it's only if we have two little e's that we get the recessive version. Now, one thing that, that can happen here is that two parents with wet earwax could actually produce a child with dry earwax. So let's say that mom and dad, mom has big E, little e, and dad also has big E, little e. So back up to here, big E, little e here, that goes with wet earwax. So they both have wet earwax. But when they reproduce, when they have a child, they're each going to give away one of those alleles, one of those letters, to their child, one version of that gene to their child. And it's possible that mom could give away her little e, and dad could give away his little e, and we end up with a child that has little e, which is dry earwax. So this explains why we can have traits where we look like mom or we look like dad, or we can have traits that neither of our parents have. So we're different from both mom and dad in those situations.